Hi, my name is Tanya. Thank you for joining me today. We're going to be here to discuss a presentation where we're looking at the global Black history, and we're looking at the Black perspective of history. The point of this presentation today is to take you through an understanding of how Black history has changed, and from a Black perspective, where have been these pivotal points. So taking you through this presentation, we will cover world history from a Black perspective. We will also look at key people in our history, and we're going to look at Black people in leadership. So as an overall, racial lines is not something which is very clear-cut. The world from a European perspective is what is initially always stated in school, in class, even on the internet and in most forms of media. But I think it's also important that we understand that obviously there was an isolated, so to speak, African experience, and which then met European powers and other kind of nations and other sets of people. Now, when this happened, we can look at multiple times in ancient African history where people from the African continent also explored. But it's also important to understand, when did Europeans come down to explore the African continent itself? Now, when we look at history, we do see early explorations of Europeans. And we do see, say, for example, the Arab slave trade from, say, the 15th century, making its way down the Swahili city-states region on the east side of the African continent. We also see an understanding that the exploration of sub-Saharan Africa was very important. There was an understanding of how there was many riches, whether it be spices, etc., that was available on the African continent. And there was minerals and gold, frankincense and things like this, which was of high value to many Europeans. So exploring sub-Saharan Africa was a huge gold mine from a very, 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 very early point in terms of European exploration onto the African continent. When we have the 15th century and we have Spain and Portugal being two European nations which really did accelerate in terms of exploring the world, they were competing against each other as well as other European nations, but it was Spain and Portugal who were really doing the most in terms of exploring other countries and bringing a lot of information, a lot of wealth back to Spain and Portugal's royal houses. By the time of 1494, we have what's called the Treaty of Tordesillas. Now, in this treaty, we have an agreement between the Spanish powers and the Portuguese powers. And these two powers are essentially agreeing that everything to this on a certain side of the globe was going to be that for the Portuguese, and literally on the other half of the globe was going to be for the Spanish. This was a way to amicably look at how they was going to exploit other nations without actually incurring fighting among themselves as Spanish and Portuguese peoples. What happens is that in order for them to feel warranted in this exploration, and in order for them to feel justified when they do go to these new lands that they find, they then use the understanding of when the Spanish go to certain nations, when the Portuguese go to certain nations, they are allowed to enslave those sets of people, and they do it under the pretense that they're doing it for religion. So they're looking to enslave non-Christian people in the countries that they find, and then when they enslave these people, they also then take the riches that they find in these particular countries. So places like, for example, Brazil would be a big example. A lot of South America and the Americas in general was like this. And they would find the local people, enslave those, and take the riches from that nation. As the Europeans were exploring and finding these particular countries, they then was also analyzing the sets of people, analyzing the native people, and getting an understanding of who these people were. And then they were also categorizing what these people would be like. And then from here, their writings and their teachings was what was later then coined into a phrase called like master race theory. So there's quite a few people that contributed to this, and I've just shown just a few. So there was Johann Blumenbach and Count Joseph de Gobineau. And these were individuals who were very pivotal in being able to explain that the race of humans could be categorized into certain sets. Now, from their understanding and what they kind of explained to people overall was that there was a hierarchy of races. Both of them was explaining how, the white race was most likely the most popular race. And then you would have categories of yellow people, brown people, and black people. Black people was the sets of people that they would put as the bottom of this pyramid. These kind of thoughts and these kind of theories would then later go on to support other people's claims as to why it would be better for European nations to take over Africa, to take over and enslave sets of non-white peoples around the world. So these European theories of master race really did help to solidify for many people what they wanted, or a certain agenda that they wanted to fulfill. So one of the key aspects also is that when these understanding of race and hierarchy of race, this is then used later on for the pro-slavery or during the time of pro-slavery arguments. And it's also being used to then also push about the understanding of eugenics, which we're going to come on to briefly later. We then also have the Scramble for Africa. The Scramble for Africa is usually being discussed many times, especially in Black History Month and things like this. And it's about the understanding that when these European powers during the 1500s are exploring the world, it doesn't just stop in the 1500s. It's going century after century after century. And even by the 1800s, Europeans really have had a good foothold on exploring the African continent and really getting a good understanding of the riches that is there and what they want to monopolize. So certain people at the same time as the Scramble for Africa is Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes is a very popular individual. He's known for his diamond mining companies in South Africa. And Cecil Rhodes was been able to really give a good example of how, for example, European powers really wanted to make a mission of taking over the African continent. Cecil Rhodes wanted to be able to make a link over the continent of Africa. And this was called from the Cape to Cairo. So this wanted to be a route of trade, which was obviously to the advantage of European powers, and that would help control all of the logistics and all of the riches that was on the continent. And it would go through a good channel all the way from the south of Africa all the way to the north in Cairo, and then taking all minerals and spices, etc., and all kind of produce from the continent, and being able to take it straight into Europe. He was not the only one. And obviously the Scramble for Africa, we know there was many people who was French, other British people, there was some Italians, and many others, even Germans, who also had some kind of territory in the continent of Africa, and they wanted to explore and make this more. Now, again, the feeling of the need to be able to have the Scramble for Africa is because of the understanding that the African itself, the African communities, no matter where they were on the continent, weren't able to manage these resources themselves, weren't well equipped enough to profit from these resources. And so it was therefore okay for other nations to come in and make this profit. And again, when underpinning the need and the necessity to go to Africa and take these resources, again, it's using all kinds of theories. And again, the curse of Ham and eugenics was just part and parcel of it. The curse of Ham is a theory, and obviously which has biblical roots. And this is the understanding of Noah being seen naked by his sons. And it's about saying which son is then going to be cursed by his father's nakedness. So in order for people to get a good understanding of the curse of Ham, it was being able to use a biblical story, which obviously in a Christian world was being used to really explain and understand why, again, people of a darker complexion, people of color, and Black people specifically, were meant to be, whether it be slaves or servants. So the curse of Ham was cursing those people who were Black, and they were cursing Ham, it's said, for eternity because of this seeing the nakedness of Noah. And then also going into eugenics, this is a theory and a process by which you have scientists, and these scientists are able to do many experiments, studies, where they're trying to take theories about race, and they're trying to also build upon this and explain it in a way of saying that social breeding was also important. So we have many people in the development of eugenics. And it's important to understand one particular person, who is Francis Galton. So he learned a lot from the first kind of teachings of Darwin, and Darwin's talking about the theory of evolution and how for the best and the strongest of a specific species to survive, you need the best of those particular animals or species that are around, and then those that mate will be the strongest, and they will then perpetuate the specific success of that species. So Galton is taking it to a human experience, and he's also saying that in order for the strongest race to survive, it needs to be the best of that particular race. And then building on the notions that, you know, people of color, Black people specifically, African people specifically, were of the lowest rank of the human race, then Galton is making assumptions based on other people before him that the best race is therefore maybe the more European race, and that race is the one that should multiply and then take over certain nations, countries, etc. Eugenics was heavily funded. Eugenics was heavily funded and heavily used to promote the work of the Nazi Party. You also have those in the German-owned regions such as Togo, and they was having experiments done on the local indigenous people. And this was looking at cranial structures, it was looking at physical features, and it was trying to be able to explain and tie in the fact that people of a darker complexion, people who are Black, people who are African, were meant to be lower in the racial hierarchy. And they were trying to put science behind the theories of the master race. And they were trying to scientifically prove that only those with a European background was the strongest of the human race. So I think the understanding of racial lines is important, because then this becomes this huge kind of marker, kind of a line in the sand of where the Black experience changes. So prior to these ideas of race, you have a Black experience which is quite, probably best word to put it is quite advantageous, and is going on better lines. When race and then lines of master race and eugenics and the curse of Ham, etc., you've got the Scramble for Africa. When all of these things are put together, then you end up with a Black experience which is now based on proving that one's race is not doesn't make you inferior. Okay. So if we go to the ancient history, just giving you three key individuals which are probably very popular in modern history, but also it's three individuals where people are familiar with an understanding of what they've done, and then also an understanding that race wasn't necessarily the huge identifying factor that these people are known for. So Imhotep was existing from 2667 BC. He's known for creating the step pyramids. He's also known to be one of the only of a few who was fully deified after his death. He became god of wisdom and medicine. Some say he became god of science, medicine, and architecture. Imhotep was also a priest, and he was also one of the succeeding kings of the third dynasty. He was a poet and a physician and a mathematician, an astronomer, and an architect. Mansa Musa. So here I'm just going to quickly take you through with Mansa Musa. He's very known as being one of the wealthiest people in the world. Even in today's money, he would still be considered one of the wealthiest people in the world. He's very known for being one of the rulers of Mali. Mali was a huge empire in West Africa. He ruled there from 1312 to 1337. He's known for going on a famous pilgrim to Mecca and bringing back with him many scholars and bringing back many artifacts. It's also Mansa Musa is one of the people who's credited with building such great cities as Timbuktu and making it internationally famous. Okay. Hannibal. Hannibal is known as being one of the best known military geniuses of any time period. He was a Carthaginian. He fought against Rome in the Second Punic War. He's born in Carthage, approximately 247 BC, and he went on to fight for Carthage against the Romans in the Second Punic War. He's famous for taking the Alps as one of his major journeys as he went to take Rome. He was ultimately unsuccessful in his battle against the Romans, and even after that he then returned to Carthage to be a statesman, and then he went on exile from Rome, and later on killing himself rather than being captured. He's known, like I said, for being a military genius. He set very high standards when it came to spy tactics and intelligence gathering. He also was very known for using nature to his advantage. So in things like using the Alps, fighting in different terrains, fighting in winter and fighting at night. So these three figures are popular, very popular people, and they are known, hopefully, by many, especially during Black History Month. You'll hear about these people, and it's also important to understand that even at their time when they're discussed and when they're spoken about, race, I don't think in any of my understanding, any of my research, race wasn't the pivotal thing that these people were known for. They were known for being, whether it be the richest, or they were known for being a military genius, or they were known for being a genius in maths, astronomy, etc. So then the Black perspective then had a very close link with the stigma of race. I think the Black perspective is then affected very much by this stigma of race. And then this goes back to the points that I was referring to before, whether it would be the theories of the master race, eugenics, whether it would be the curse of Ham, the pro-slavery speak, and the scramble for Africa. All of these things are then what's bringing about a turn for the Black experience. And then rather than having great Black leaders, you then end up having a series of events in Black history, which is about protecting those that are Black, protecting those who are of color. So the first of the ones I was going to look at for this presentation was going to be Haiti. So Haiti, this is a Haitian revolution that took place from 1791 to 1804. This Haitian revolution, I think, was important because you see a very complex situation happening with ultimately the liberation of Black people by Black people. So the history of it is you've got Haiti was France's wealthiest overseas colony. It produced sugar, coffee, indigo, and cotton. And this was all done by the forced labor of Black people. The structure of the society was very layered. So you had white slave owners, and you also had what was called the Petit Blancs. And these would have been shopkeepers, teachers, etc. They only numbered 40,000, and they were highly outnumbered by then the Black population. The Black population on the island comprised of free men, enslaved men, and also a maroon community. The slave population was approximately 500,000 people. So this was very high in numbers and obviously easily outnumbered than the white population. There was multiple Haitian-born revolutionary movements inspired by events in France. So the politics that was actually happening between the white classes in France heavily affected that in Haiti. And the power of these white slave owners, etc., in Haiti were very, was a time when it was a lot of friction with what was happening back in France. And due to this friction, you had those people in Haiti, even white Haitians, who were speaking of revolutionary thoughts because of what was happening back in France. They wanted more power for themselves in Haiti and more power for their representation back in France. Because of the amount of revolutionary sentiment and thought, and especially with the French Revolution also happening, then this then brought about a time for the slaves and the Black community in Haiti to also strike. So one of the people to take advantage of this situation and the tension between white Haitians and their white French counterparts was Toussaint. Toussaint Overture became the prominent leader of the enslaved population, rebelling against the planters on the 21st of August, 1791. By 1792, these African enslaved people, led by Toussaint, controlled a third of the island. Before the fighting ended, there's a huge numbers of casualties. 100,000 of the 5,000 Blacks and 24,000 of the 40,000 whites were all killed. The British had arrived by 1793, And with the British there, you now have a black class of mostly enslaved Africans, not only fighting their white slave owners, but also you've got them fighting French soldiers as well coming from France. And they're also fighting the British that have also arrived. There was also Spanish enforcements as well that came as well. So you had a black enslaved community fighting almost, 3 or 4 different sets of people. When the British did arrive 1793, they ended up withdrawing 5 years later after a series of defeats by Overture and his forces. By 1801, Toussaint has expanded the revolution beyond Haiti, conquering the neighboring Spanish colony of San Domingo, which is the modern-day Dominican Republic. He abolished slavery in the Spanish-speaking colony and declared himself Governor General for life for the entire island of Hispaniola. Overture was eventually captured by the French, and he died later in prison by 1803. But even after his death, you see that the revolution in Haiti, a black-led revolution, was not killed or finished just by the death of Toussaint. And you have Dessalines, who's another ex-slave, who's also risen to prominence as a general in the fighting. And then he continues the revolution. He then, by 18th of November, 1803, he then forces the French to defeat. And then by January the 1st, 1804, Dessalines declares the national independence and renamed the island to Haiti. So here you've got a situation where you've got a black population which is purely fighting because of their status as being enslaved. They're liberating and freeing themselves from an oppression which is European. And they're fighting multiple sets of Europeans who all have different vying interests in the colony, not just for money, but also just for power in general. So then when we come to Marcus Garvey and the UNIA, now Marcus Garvey and the UNIA is also another organization. This is one of the biggest organizations, which is of African descent. Marcus Garvey himself was born 17th of August 1887 in St. Anne's Bay, Jamaica. It was he that went on to launch the UNIA, him and several colleagues, on the 1st of August 1914. The first UNIA division was formed in New York in May 1917. Within a month, the organization had 2 million members all over the United States. And by the 1920s, the UNIA had 1,100 chapters in 40 countries around the world. And this included the UK, Cuba, Panama, Costa Rica, and Ghana. Now, Marcus Garvey had spent time, even before starting the UNIA, traveling and seeing the world and seeing that the African experience, especially in South Americas, etc., was always where the African community was at the bottom. So his need and his drive to create the UNIA was something, again, of essentially liberation. And this can go, again, back to the Haitian example. So by the time that now he's created something like the UNIA, it did take a lot of people by surprise, and it was very quickly very popular among Black people. The Marcus Garvey launched the UNIA's first major commercial venture, and this was the Black Star Line steamship. This started in New York in 1919, and this was there to promote communication, trade, commerce among Black people around the world. So it was intended to be something which would have a fleet of ships, and that would be used to the advantage of Black commerce. You have things like the whole month of August in 1920, the UNI had its first convention. This was held in New York City. It was done at New York Liberty Hall and Madison Square Garden. With an estimated 25,000 Black people attended, including 25 African delegates from different African nations. Also, it's so important to understand that the model that Marcus Garvey is also using is that by learning from other peoples, not just from other Africans, but also an understanding that liberation was also a class thing. So the UNIA is also looking heavily at the Irish experience, where you have Ireland trying to pull apart from the British rule. So there's an understanding that, yes, there is race, and race is the clear driver, but he's also understanding there's a lot to learn from how Europeans also fought with other Europeans on the lines of class. By 1926, we had a membership of the UNIA, and this had grown to over 11 million members worldwide. And the FBI established what they called is a special counterintelligence program, which was COINTERPOL. And this was designed to neutralize the threat of what they called a Black Messiah. So between the years of 1956 and 1971, the FBI would use the COINTERPOL program, but it was birthed from being able to follow organizations like Marcus Garvey and the UNIA. Marcus Garvey was jailed for approximately 2 years. This was on many accounts, people say, trumped up charges done by the FBI. After being jailed for 2 years, his sentence was commuted and he was deported to Jamaica by 1927. 1928, Garvey had created a People's Political Party. Now, the reason for this was because during his time of being incarcerated in America, and by the time he's then been deported back to Jamaica, the following of the UNIA had started to decline. And he decided to go back to Jamaica in order to be able to build another political party and have a political base to help him with his work in the UNIA. This was a political party which had a huge investment in the interest of the Black majority. With his political career in Jamaica not being successful, he then decides to return to London for a period. And he's trying to help the UNIA regain its former glory and again get international attention once more. His efforts in this didn't necessarily work, and he dies. He dies by the 10th of June, 1940. So the work of Marcus Garvey and the UNIA, again, is something which is birthed along the lines of race. And it's about identifying the fact that you have many Black people around the world who are experiencing essentially a perspective of life which is worse because of their race. And he's using the UNIA as a form of upliftment and a Pan-African movement to be able to stop the treatment that has been put on the Black community. So the third and final group that I was going to look at was going to be the Black Panther Party. Now, the Black Panther Party is a group who was very popular in American history during the 1960s. By 1965, Malcolm X had been assassinated, and this had really inspired many groups in America to do something, and one of the most popular ones is the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party is founded on the 15th of October, 1966, and they're founded in Oakland, California. They established themselves and the need to demand and declare what they feel is necessary for the Black community to survive. So in this particular instance, as we know, you've got a Black community in America who's obviously been oppressed by the system itself, whether it be the judicial system, the police system, the educational system, in every single capacity. And they have no independent place for themselves apart from being in the communities that they are scattered across America. So they do demand what they call a 10-point plan, and this is about being able to demand rights for themselves, including land, possession, housing, employment, rights to a better education, and also to be able to protect themselves from police brutality. fighting to ensure that their constitutional rights for Black people are upheld. And they're also trying to protect Black men and Black women from state-sanctioned violence. So the Black Panther members were known to be policing the police by watching police arrests, watching police raids. They were monitoring how the police were actually treating and attacking, most of the time, other Black people. There is known to be shootouts between the Black Panthers and the local police. And this was just, to protect those people who were Black in the community, who were being brutalized by the police around them. The history of the Black Panther Party is also one of violence. So you do have many shootings and fatalities of members and of police. By 1967, Hugh P. Newton, one of the founders, was charged for fatally wounding a 23-year-old police officer. And then you also have people like Eldridge Cleaver, who was then taking on leadership to be able to free people like Huey P. The Black Panther Party were also very proud in terms of promoting Black beauty and about Black self-esteem as part of one of their main principles. And so you'll see there's many times images of women and men sporting afros, berets, wearing the black leather jacket, and also and using their right to bear arms. For the Black Panther Party, the visual understanding of Black pride was also just as equally as important as promoting, say, for example, a 10-point plan. By 1968, the Black Panthers had roughly 2,000 members across the country. So like the UNIA, the FBI was heavily targeting the Black Panther Party. This was now one of the biggest threats that they felt to national security since the time of Marcus Garvey. There was approximately 290 contra-pro actions against people of color, and 245 of those were targeted at the Black Panthers specifically. So there was propaganda that was used, there was the infiltration of spies that was used, and different tactics in order to disrupt and disturb what the Black Panthers were about. You have prominent members like Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, who were gunned down in 1969 by police. And again, these were essentially assassinations trying to kill down a very young and vibrant and strong leadership that was coming up through the ranks of the Black Panthers. They also was working hard in terms of making a school system to ensure that a next generation of young Black people were educated about the plight of the Black experience. And again, understanding that the Black experience was essentially based on race. We had schools which taught English, maths, and science, in addition to classes on Black history and on culture. They're looking at the prevalence of institutional racism and what it actually means and how it affects you in life. They had many schools, and one of their most popular was the Liberation School in Oakland. By the 1970s, most of the Panthers were actually women. And so then you'll have many pictures of women such as Kathleen Cleaver, Asita Shakur, and Elaine Brown. We also have people like Angela Davis, who technically wasn't an actual member, but she was also heavily affiliated with the Black Panthers. From Oakland, the Black Panthers, they grew over 48 chapters, grew to chapters in 48 states, in North America. And they also had international support. So they had many groups in countries like Japan, France, Germany, Sweden, Algeria, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Uruguay, and many more. By 1972, Newton was shot down Newton had shut down, many of the Black Panther chapters across the country and decided to centralize the movement in Oakland. So we have a time where, due to many years of a lot of police harassment and wearing down of the organization, due to much of the killing of many of the top leaders and the arrest of many women and men in the organization, you also have many people, famously like Asita Shakur, who then also go into exile. So they're not able to stay and support the organization. So it starts to kind of wane, and it starts to kind of close, and it starts to kind of lose its momentum and the energy that it had before. So then we find that by 1982, the Black Panther officially is dissolved. And unfortunately, then it comes to a close for an organization such as this. You have some of the schools which were still in operations, but it was not to the same extent, obviously, as it was in its height during the late 1960s, early 1970s. So then, with an understanding again of the Black Panthers, similar to the Haitian Revolution, similar to the UNIA, and similar to the Black Panthers, we see that from the outset, these are groups, organizations, historical events that have been spurred on because of the situation and the plight of Black people at the time. So you don't find that these are no longer individuals from a Black perspective like Imhotep or Hannibal or Mansa Musa. These are people who are essentially fighting to survive because they're being attacked purely based on their race. So I find that Black history, even if you don't look at necessarily these examples, but apartheid will be the same. The colonial countries on the continent not getting their independence until the 60s, 70s, but again, even after independence, are again being treated poorly, purely based on race and purely based by European powers. And again, it's based on the understanding that, there's a hierarchy of race and status, and those people of color are permanently at the bottom. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. I hope that you found it interesting. I hope you found it informative. And I'm more than happy to then be open up for questions. Schools and slavery as Black